What's up, guys? This is Matt, Colorado Spirits Collective. We're here in Buena Vista, Colorado, and we're at Deerhammer Distilling Co. And I'm joined by Lenny Eckstein, who is the co-founder and jack of all trades.
Yeah, kind of do it all. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, man. We're stoked to have you out here.
Yeah, but yeah. So, you're gonna start by kind of telling us about how you managed to get out here and where you started, and it's pretty I guess, interesting story.
It's got the potential to be a long story, but a few snippets of, I guess, how we got out here and how this all got going. I moved out to Colorado in my 20s, and I was living in Denver and was pretty enamored by a lot of things. I mean, primarily the mountains and the access to, fun and adventure and, breaking out of what I always knew. And I also, at that time in the early 2000s, the craft beer scene was really starting to boom, and that really grabbed my attention. And a lot of things grabbed my attention, as did whitewater kayaking. That was another one. I started coming out here to Buena Vista to paddle the Arkansas River, which is just over there. Yeah. And I love this valley. I always have, and since my first time here, I always thought it would be an amazing place to be and be inspired by living here. So I guess to jump back and forth a little bit, I did find myself, I was working as a graphic designer. That was kind of my profession, even before getting out of college. It was always work, always working for agencies and corporations, and that was cool. But I always needed these other outlets, and I happened to have an office at one point in the early 2000s near a homebrew supply store. Wandered out with a carload of equipment, and that began the journey into all things grain-based fermentation and beverage alcohol, and making real things that weren't necessarily pixels and visuals on a screen. So
sitting behind a computer.
Exactly. Computers are cool. We still use them here, but the more hands, the more grit, the better. Right. And I guess over the years, really using beer, I mean, as weird as it sounds, that became almost a creative outlet, a medium for expression, something to hone. I often talk about loving the process of starting at the bottom and sucking, because the journey upwards is so rewarding, and there's no end. You never, you can hear the term master brewer, master distiller, master whatever. Yeah. I don't know what that means. Right. Do you ever achieve the finality of absolute greatness? I mean, that's why I'm here, is because there's always more to hone. And I guess through all that beer study and practice, and just wanting to advance it, I started to pick up on what I think I was missing in whiskey, which prior was maybe someone pouring a shot of Jameson or Makers or whatever. And that was fine. It tasted nice, but I started to realize there was a whole lot more going on.
Yeah, for sure.
And the parallels between beer production and whiskey production were very similar. And at the time, I think this was in 2008 or so. Stranahan's blazed the trail earlier than that. Seeing what they were doing, and guys at Downslope and Peach Street, and realizing they were doing some amazing things, but the opportunity to put one's own imprint on what craft distilling was becoming was so huge, and it was something that just seemed like I couldn't ignore. I couldn't keep computering while I saw this opportunity on the side.
Yeah, and just kind of drew you in.
It did.
More than just an interest.
Yeah, it was. It became. It was an undeniable attraction, and I figured, worst off, I quit my career in design, and I fail at distilling. I'll figure something out. I don't know. Maybe I'll be a river guide. But I haven't failed at distilling quite yet. So I'm still.
I was gonna say, looking at how big this barrel room is, I guess I'd say you're doing pretty good.
Yeah, so. I guess I jump ahead, and things are going great. We're a small distillery by all rights. Yeah. We only produce about 200 or so barrels a year, but we're making what we want the way we want, and it goes back to, being able to put one's own imprint, fingerprint on what they want to do, what I want to do in craft distilling, and that's what I get to do. So it's pretty cool.
So like you said, that's what you want to do, and you're putting your own imprint or fingerprint on like kind of the Colorado industry of distillery or distilling and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In 2010 is when you guys officially became Deerhammer.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about like how you got like the name, how it came, your I guess idea came to reality and turned into all of this?
I mean, a lot of things lined up, I guess, to allow it to happen, and spare you some of the boring parts. But I mean, in short, I guess my wife Amy at the time, maybe we were engaged to be married. I don't know. Maybe it was a little before. Yeah. But we both decided we were living in Golden at the time, and I made it known that I don't know if I made it known that this was going to happen as much as she just saw me, between brewing like unhealthy amounts of beer in our basement gold and or distilling the fermentations into new make or white dog and ultimately throwing it in a mason jar with some oak chips. I think she kind of knew the course that it was going. Yeah. At some point, I remember we got married in Mexico in 2010, and I remember being in Mexico and telling our friends, hey, we're opening a distillery. And a big part of that wasn't because we were, it was to force my feet to the fire and make it a reality. Because I just figured if I told like 25 or so of my closest friends and family that it was happening, there was no way I wasn't going to do it. Like on some level.
They're gonna ask you down the road, like, hey, you said you were starting a distillery.
Yeah, I don't want to fail before I even started, so I had to at least start. And with that, we knew we wanted to be in Buena Vista. Made a lot of trips up here, looked for the right places, and like a lot of distilleries, we were looking around in industrial parks, of which there are not many here. We had a really hard time finding a building, but the fortunate side of that, what seemed like a problem, was that we ended up finding a great building right on BV's historic East Main Street, and along the way, we pondered all these names, but in trying to pay some level of respect to the history of this town that we hold and held in such high regard, but we're not really locals at the time. We wanted something historically relevant, and we came across one of the namesakes of one of the very first settlers' original residents here, with the last name Deerhammer, and thought that's kind of fitting. It just fits what we're going for. We want to make a gritty, full-flavored whiskey that embodies some form of adventure, and the settler thing kind of made sense. And there's deer everywhere. Yeah. So it all clicked.
Yeah, I think it's one of you guys have one of the more interesting names, and it just makes you wonder where does the name come from?
I know.
What is Deerhammer?
I should plant some tall tale seeds of what the Deerhammer is. But,
yeah, that'd be funny for sure. And then a lot of your lineup is single malt.
Yeah.
And that's, you like to experiment with different kinds of things like that, and specifically one of them being your ingredients. So do you want to go into where you get them from and the different types and that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like any distillery that's, I guess, in a sense, starting fresh with the concept of what they want to do, they're going to take some time to find their I don't know, I guess flavor, whether it's literal flavor or just their general vibe of what they're going after. And single malt was definitely something we were going for, and at the time I wasn't sure if that was a great idea, but we've come around to really consider ourselves fortunate that we stuck to that goofball idea and didn't necessarily make bourbon right away. But with regards to ingredients, that's something that has taken some time to come to understand as well. And us, like a lot of distilleries, kind of take on these standards or make our own rules of here's what we do. We, we'll get local if it's good, but if, quality matters first. And of course quality matters. Right. And if grain is a very important aspect of it, I often look at what are the impactful aspects of whiskey production, and you can look at all aspects, and I can certainly point at ones I don't think are impactful. Grain is very impactful. It's not just where the grain is grown, it's how it's handled. And in the case of American single malt, we're talking about malted barley, so it's not just the growing of the barley, and Colorado grows a good amount of barley, but then it's the malting of the barley. And how is that handled? And then in some cases with our single malt, we use kilned malted barley and roasted malted barley, and how is that handled, and what flavors do we get? So, starting from the very beginning, we were sourcing where we could source from, which was in often cases, a lot of stuff was coming from Minnesota. There's a really great independent maltster up there, one of the oldest in the country. They make some great stuff. We've since had the opportunities to work with some local maltsters in Root Shoot out on the Front Range, and there's Proximity Malt, maybe an hour and a half from here, over in San Luis Valley. So, as craft, be it beer or spirits, has grown, our opportunities and availability of grains have grown. So that was a long way of saying we do try to use local grain whenever we can, and it's not just from a quality standpoint, but also to some extent a taste of place, because for example, like rye that's grown in the San Luis Valley, a strain of rye, in our case we use Elbon rye in our pot still rye whiskey. That is a strain of rye that grows well in sandy soil and a more arid climate, and a climate like ours. I want to use grains that are appropriate to our climate. So yeah.
Cool. And then you guys kind of do, I guess we're trying to figure this question out before, about just the distillation process in general and how you guys kind of started, and then laws changed stuff, but you want to go into...
Yeah, well, with regards to distillation process, and again, this will go back to, in a sense, like, what are the impactful aspects of whiskey making? There's always choices. What is that choice going to do? Is that choice for efficiency in yielding as much alcohol as possible, or is it for yielding flavor and maybe not getting as much alcohol out of the raw goods? Right. There's hardly a whiskey I don't love, whether it be from some country that is not necessarily known for whiskey production, or a new distillery whose whiskey has only been in the barrel for sub 1 year. There's all these qualities and things that play into it. And from my perspective, I really like pot still whiskey, and that's to say, using the most rudimentary form of distillation equipment. Kind of goes back to like less computers, more hands. In modern whiskey, and there's a lot of historians that have documented the process of industrialized production. It's very common to make whiskey on low rectification column stills that run continuously, and they yield a certain flavor, and that's a fine flavor. But none of what we got into was to replicate existing flavors. It's done. Now, while pot stills are also done, it's another tool, and I think it's a very impactful tool. Our first pot still, which it was a 150-gallon handmade copper pot still, made in a Scottish style, a very squat head. Everything was with the intention of going full flavor. From day one, our intention was to do direct fire pot still distillation, particularly with single malt. That's a really nice way to go. I think it's overlooked. It allows for kettle caramelization from the high heat, and it'll yield big flavors that you're just not going to get otherwise with steam heat or electric heat. And unfortunately, one of the problems is insurance companies hate it, fire inspectors hate it. Everyone hates it except for the whiskey drinkers. Right. So we got to a point where ultimately we had to kind of throw in the towel on direct fire pot distillation for now. And now we're all steam. Okay. So we have to look at other ways, like how do we impact our flavor? And I still feel very strongly that a pot still will yield the biggest flavor and the longest finish of really any production matter in whiskey distillation. So that's how we go with
cool.
stills.
Sweet. And then you guys have obviously a decent lineup of just whiskeys
we've got a
here.
Few.
And one of the really cool things that I think is different and intrigued me for you guys to be one of the top distilleries for me to come visit is I'm probably gonna say it wrong, but the Progeny.
Oh, Progeny. You can call it Progeny if you want.
Okay. Progeny series.
Yeah.
You want to tell us about how that got started and what that is and where you can get it?
Yeah. Well, the concept behind Progeny, or ultimately an offspring of sorts based on the name, it's the whole intention behind this series. I'm gonna pour myself a little bit. I haven't had this one in a while. The Progeny series. It's a collaboration with other Colorado makers that we have to plan. You want?
Sure.
We have to plan a ways in advance because this stuff we typically want to age for 3, 5, 7 years and really see where it goes. It allows us to answer the question, what do you have that's new? Which comes up all the time, which I get in beer. You know, when you go to like a beer festival, you can ask what's new because they just made it a couple weeks ago.
Right.
In whiskey, that's a really tough one to answer. You know, we've been planning this stuff for so long. Our minimum maturation is 2 years, but really we almost never pull a 2-year barrel. So to the point of the Progeny series, collaborations with other Colorado makers where it's done once and that's it, and we move on. It comes out once a year. Typically in October, although this year's might be a little slower to the shelf. Our first Progeny series was done with Cultura Craft Chocolate, where we worked with them to score a whole lot of roasted Guatemalan cacao that we seasoned barrels with and then gave back to them to make chocolate. And we put our single malt back into those barrels. So that was a really cool effort. Just an unconventional seasoning of sorts to a barrel where typically like sherry, port, rum, all these
Chardonnay,
other barrels. Right. Nobody really puts cacao in a barrel. It doesn't even sound right to say.
I wouldn't even think to do anything like that.
Totally.
Yeah.
But it's pretty cool. I mean, it's ultimately a fruit from a tree that's fermented and then makes one of the most delicious things out there in chocolate. So it was cool to work with, other producers. In this case, a really dedicated bean to bar chocolate producer. In the case of what we're drinking now, this is Progeny 2. It's titled Cask Savant. This was a collaboration with Crooked Stave Brewery, which we've always been huge fans of. They're known for making these amazing beers fermented with Brettanomyces, which is sort of a different yeast strain than what we typically use in our standard Saccharomyces profiles of yeast. These strains will yield totally different profiles in fermentation, and they come through in the distillation process. So you get these the same kind of earthy, sometimes leathery notes, sometimes citrus, sometimes fruity notes that can be yielded depending on the fermentation temp and general handling. And we got to experiment with that through a few thousand gallons of one of their beers that we ran through our stills and matured for 5 years. So this one's a pretty outrageous one that we released last year, and we've got more on the horizon.
So good. Yeah,
that's coming soon. Progeny Redstone.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a very unique and different type of whiskey for sure, which is I'm assuming would be what you're kind of going for, and nobody else.
That is the goal. I mean, that is what Deerhammer's all about. It's be it in the Progeny series or really across the board.
Right.
There's nothing we make.
Innovation, I guess, is what I was the
yeah,
word
innovation.
I was going for there.
I mean, sometimes we call it fuckery, but it's really it's about trying to be where others are not, and in the best way possible. About bringing great flavors, like catching people off guard sometimes, having them take a sip and be like, "Whoa, wasn't expecting that. That's interesting." That's where we thrive.
Cool. So you kind of touched on it with the Progeny series.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is this guy right here. You want to bring us into the rest of the lineup?
Yeah, well...
break it down.
I guess starting from on this side, I think starting with our American single malt, I touched on it earlier, but it's really what we're all about. In all of our production, 50% of our production is dedicated to American single malt. A few years into making American single malt, my partner and wife, Amy, asked me, you sure this is a good idea? Do people care about American single malt? And I, not so confidently, was like, yeah, it's a great idea. Nah. Fortunately, it's fine. I mean, we've always done fine with it, and I'm really proud of this stuff. But it's finally coming around where people are starting to understand what it might be about, and hopefully if the government ever qualifies it as an official category, I think we'll see even more traction. But our American single malt, this is kind of our cornerstone offering. It's what we're all about. It's what we're most known for. It's 100% malted barley. Grain bill wise, it's almost 80% 2-row pale malt, and then pretty much an even split of Crystal 45, Crystal 120, chocolate malt. We've messed around with various yeasts, but we've settled on a really nice yeast right now. It's a very high ester forming yeast, which kind of lends some of the subtle fruit notes that you pick up on after about 3 or 4 years in the barrel. Our barrel profile for this, for maturation, is 53-gallon heavy toast light char New American oak. It's pretty much the same across the board. So this is what we're most known for. Moving down the line, we've got our port cask finished American single malt, which has been really fun for us.
Yep.
It's a tasty one.
Definitely my favorite.
Yeah.
Usually my favorite.
It's a neat one. I think I like going down the traditional route. Like we mix things up on some areas, then we fall back on tradition, and I like going towards port cask finish because that's always been done historically in Scotland anyway.
Right.
It's our single malt that goes 2 years in the standard barrel profile, and then minimum 2 years in export blend of Ruby and Tawny, 100 proof. This one's pretty tasty. Big flavor. Moving down the line. Okay.
Sorry, no, you're good. And then just on how long you age it in the port cask.
Yeah.
Like you guys do it a little bit longer than
Yeah.
most.
That's
distillery.
a good distinction and worth bringing up. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I hate to say, I don't know. I don't always like to hang my hat on like, well, we do it this way and they do it. But I guess, yes, that is a fact. We typically in first fill port, we'll go in, and while it's more standard to go 3 to 6 months on average for most distilleries, we'll push it. You know, like our first release of this over a year ago was a year and a half. But something we did that's kind of interesting, we do this a lot, is we will marry together barrels and put them back again. So once we know that the blend is right, they can go back in the barrels, and we have our our range that we have to work with for the next year to 2 years. So in this case, we put back this marriage into these 10 port barrels and let it continue to age. So yeah, I mean, we had a year and a half in export, and then we went back into those port barrels from the few that we pulled for the bottling, and then it hit 2 years, and pretty soon we're going to be at 3 years in export. So it's got some longevity there. It's definitely a different approach, and it's just our way of kind of doing things a little differently. Yeah,
and that's kind of like what I think makes like you guys, back to the whole like innovation thing, like the most that I've heard from anybody, specifically Colorado, I think in general though, it was usually about like 10 months or so is the longest. And
right.
But, I mean, it's delicious. So if you find it on the shelf, like you better buy it, because boom. Yeah, it's out there for now. We'll have more next year.
For sure.
Go to the next one there.
So moving down the line, we've got our 4-grain bourbon. This is another one, like, kind of true to theme of sorts, where, I have such admiration for what's being done primarily in Kentucky, which is unquestionably like the motherland of bourbon at this point, historically as well.
But bourbon isn't only made in Kentucky.
That's right.
I'll argue that all day with whoever.
Yeah. I mean, there's some great bourbons coming out all over the country, but our goal was to, with all respect to those styles of bourbons, decide what else can we do within the confines of bourbon. As most folks know watching this, just the standards, 51% corn, charred new oak, and there's a bunch of other boring stuff. Right. But, with this one, we went with, a lot of Colorado grains, a lower corn grain bill. So we're at about, if I always get the numbers wrong, 65% Colorado corn. It's a yellow corn grown down at Ute Mountain Farm that's a food grade versus a feed grade corn. So there's already big flavor there. Right. 20% wheat, Colorado wheat grown in the San Luis Valley. 10% oats, which are not utilized in bourbon or American whiskeys in general too often, although they do have pretty deep history in whiskey making overseas. Oats lend a tremendous mouthfeel and have a really cool flavor, almost like a little bit of a Honey Nut Cheerio note to it. Not that that's a real food, but you get everybody knows what Honey Nut Cheerios taste like.
That's what I eat for breakfast every day.
Yeah. And then we rounded out one of our kind of uniting flavor profiles is using some dark roasted malt to lend like this chocolate coffee note overarching. So what we're shooting for here is a bourbon that has some familiarity to the bourbon drinker, but really challenges the style. It's got a lot of like kind of roasted, like almost like a toasted chestnut note, some maple, sometimes some baking spice notes, cinnamon. We also go, like I mentioned, we do in our bourbon as well, heavy toast, light char. So that kind of changes the profile up a bit and lends some kind of baking spice, confectionery notes. So really unique bourbon. This stuff is typically aged between 3 and 4 years. We do have a few bottled and bond releases of this in the past, as well as a few more coming up. But I love this stuff. It's been a fun project.
Yeah.
I guess I'll keep moving down the line. We've got our hickory smoked corn whiskey, which again, like kind of like looking at what historically is done in this country. And corn whiskey is a government designated style. It doesn't get a lot of representation. You know, some folks know of mellow corn, and I believe the guys at Laws have done a corn whiskey. Not a ton of them out there though.
Yeah.
The guys at Snitching Lady, not too far, do a really nice corn whiskey. Our concept here was corn whiskey has to be at least 85% corn. Okay. And oddly, it cannot be aged in charred new oak, like everything has to be aged. Huh. So with this one, we typically go into our ex-bourbon barrels, kind of to round it out a little, as well as our ex-single malt barrels sometimes. But what we do differently with this, we use 100% Colorado grown corn, that same Ute Mountain corn as the bourbon. And we cold smoke about 15% of it with hickory wood at our distillery in a custom-made smoker for about 6 to 8 hours. It's a huge pain in the ass to do. But you can't buy the flavors that it produces, so we make them. And that's a nice one. You know, I like that as a Colorado grain to glass that's like under $40 on the shelf.
Yeah, and we tasted through some barrels here too, and I got to taste one of the ones over here, and it's by no means mellow corn. No. That's for sure.
I mean, I love the guys at Heaven Hill, but we're trying to be different. Yeah, we're trying to do our thing.
Yeah, no, but it's definitely one of the solid corn.
This one in particular is single barrel bottling from ABV Network, and this one's bonkers. This was my favorite barrel, and then somebody bought it, so I guess it still is. But
as I say, you still got bottles of it. So.
Yeah. This one's super tasty. Just big caramel corn. Tastes like corn thrown on the grill. Now it's just so rich.
Oh, yeah. It's like straight like that fancy street corn like you can get like from a food truck.
Yeah.
It's like...
Yeah, in fact I took a road trip down through California trying to sell whiskey and but mostly surfing and mountain biking. Yeah. And
priorities, right?
Rolled into Ensenada and went to a mountain bike festival and ended up pouring whiskey for a bunch of mountain bikers alongside some Mexican breweries, and there was a guy across the way from me that was serving the traditional Mexican style grilled corn. Nice. And it was just fun. Like I didn't speak a lick of Spanish, he didn't speak any English, but we were like, hell yeah, cheers, corn, whiskey. Anyway, fun stuff, corn whiskey. I'd like to see more of it out there.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a good one for sure.
Yeah, and then I guess moving down the line, we talked about the progeny, but the last one, it's a standard mainstay, and it's probably our newest release, although we've been making it for about 5 years, is our pot still rye. Again, like trying to take a Colorado stance and using grains that are local to here. I mentioned we use Colorado grown Elbon rye. So it's 70% Elbon rye, 20% oats, and the remainder roasted barley. It's a really interesting rye. It's another approach of saying, like, you know what, maybe the lion's share of rye currently and historically has come out of a really good distillery in Indiana, MGP, and I love the stuff, but it's one profile. Mm-hmm. And while I can tweak it a bit, what else can we do with rye? I mean, the confines are so broad. 51% rye. Everything else is almost fair game, new oak. So we went after a different flavor profile. I find it's got some some grassy notes that I really like in rye, some caramel notes for sure. I get a bit of a cream coffee quality that comes from the oats and the chocolate malt. And our typical bottling is at 88 proof, which I think, being a pot distilled whiskey, can hold up at that slightly lower proof point. Mm-hmm. But we do some single barrels here and there as well at like 105 to 110 proof that are money. So yeah, it's some nice stuff.
I feel like too, like Colorado rye is definitely different than, like you said, like your your MGP rye or
Yeah.
from somewhere else. Like even like geographically, like if you got rye from like northern Colorado versus San Luis Valley,
That is
like
true.
even like specifically like Laws, like their rye, their San Luis Valley rye
That's right,
is
yeah.
very different than like any other kind of thing, and it's just based on the geographically, whatever, is where it's from. So.
Yeah, and we were I was mentioning earlier. I had a sample of some of the stuff from the guys at 291. I love what they do.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to try a sample of identical products. The only difference being where the rye was grown, and there is a subtle difference there. Now, that's really interesting to me because then you're truly tasting the impacts of rye grown. Well, in this case, one country versus another country, Colorado versus Germany, and that's real. Like that's undeniable. What's interesting though that you brought up is like so grain, very impactful aspect. Methods of distillation are using a pot still or column still. To some extent yeast, but I mean maybe an unpopular opinion, but my opinion is that not as impactful as a lot of people tend to feel. I've done a lot of experiments.
Yeah.
It's really hard to make massively different whiskey.
Right.
Now that being said, there are some yeast that you could use that will impart very different flavors. But really, it's just fermentation as a whole. It's not just the yeast. It's how you handle your fermentation. Is it warm? Is it cooler? Are you temp controlling it? Is it long? Is it short? Are you building up, other additions from the native flora, like strains of lactobacillus that might exist here but be different in Denver?
Right.
So there's all kinds of ways to impart flavor, and it's really like we have colors to paint with, and we have to decide what the painting scale look like or taste like.
Yeah.
So
Cool. And then where can we find you on social media? And the .com and whatnot.
Right. So social media wise, it's at Deerhammer across the board. Kind of lazy on Twitter these days, but Facebook and Instagram for sure. The website.
I feel like everybody's kind of lazy on
boring.
Twitter.
Yeah.
Nowadays.
What do you say?
Yeah. It's like Instagram is like Twitter but with pictures.
Yeah, and pictures are fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, there, our website, deerhammer.com.
Yep.
Exciting development there. We finally figured out the legal mechanisms to allow whiskey to be ordered online and shipped to consumer, which doesn't have a whole lot to do with us in terms of the shipping.
Right.
But there's companies that are making that work now. So people can order our whiskeys online, which is great. And you can come see us in BV as well.
Yeah. And then where is your tasting room? And
Yeah. So I highly encourage everyone to come visit Buena Vista. We're right in the middle of the state, which I always have to answer for people like, "Where's Buena Vista?" It's just point to the middle of the state, you'll hit BV. It's right at the headwaters of the Arkansas River, and our distillery and tasting room are right on the East Main Street. It's a very small town, maybe 2,800 people. It's not too hard to find anything. So
you'll find Main Street if you just drive here. So
yeah.
And then what is the address there on
Oh,
Main Street?
321 East Main Street. So pretty easy to find. Walk around, you'll find us.
Yeah. Or just ask a local. Where's Deerhammer, and they'll tell you. And then distribution wise, you kind of hit on it with you can buy it online. What website do you guys use, and then where can we find you and whatnot?
Well, with distribution, we're a primarily Colorado brand. We make everything here. We sell most of our stuff in Colorado, and we are available in most of the state. If you ever wander into a liquor store and they don't have our stuff, it's just a matter of being like, "Hey, can you get me this bottle?" They can. Yep. So that's always an option. But yeah, the online thing, folks can just go to deerhammer.com and order right there. Mostly it ships from California and New York, but it'll get to your door. And California, it's on the shelf a bit. Maybe a little bit in Florida.
Yeah.
We're still, we do our thing. We sell what we make, and we're not trying to take over the world. We're just trying to make whiskey we love.
Yeah.
Get it into the right hands. So.
Cool. Sweet.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having us again.
Thanks for making the voyage.
Yeah, of course. Follow Colorado Spirits Collective on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, that kind of thing. And stay tuned for the next video. So,
Cheers.
Cheers.